Great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Welcome to this special launch of the special issue that Thom Huebner convened for the journal Linguistic Landscapes. And Thom will give us a bit of an introduction to that in a minute. One of the things that hopefully we'll cover in this session, sorry, just trying to find that, is thinking about the ways in which Linguistic Landscapes is being taken in a range of different directions. And this is certainly what having as, I'm just trying to mute all. So, yeah, so Thom is going to talk us through the ways in which he's taken this this particular paper to give you the introduction to what we've seen. At the Journal of Linguistic Landscapes, we're always looking for new and exciting submissions, both as individual papers, but also as special issues. I don't think it breaks any confidence to say that in this volume, in 2022, we'll have a special issue devoted to COVID-19 and the linguistic landscape that will be appearing in the second half of the year. But if you are interested in submitting a proposal, do get in touch with us, because we are all looking for new special issues. I'm going to now hand over to Thom Huebner, who's going to introduce today's presentation, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, Thom.
Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in. And a special thank you to Elana and Robert for coming up with this idea and arranging the details of the meeting. An earlier version of each of the 5 papers we'll hear about today was presented at the 11th Linguistic Landscape Workshop in Bangkok in 2019, the first ever, by the way, held in Asia. And so I'd like to thank Professors Pittiawat, Amara, Hawadi, and the faculty, staffs, and students at Chulalongkorn University and universities throughout Thailand who all participated to make this workshop a success. After the workshop, a call for papers for a special issue went out, and the 5 papers here were chosen for their common focus on diasporic Asian communities. And so another special thanks to the authors of these papers and to our 2 discussants in today's presentation. The purpose of today's gathering is to explore the intersection of diaspora and linguistic landscape. To my knowledge, while acknowledging the work of the Ben Raphaels in 2010 and Walter Miriam and Lanza in 2015 and others, this issue, this special issue, is the only volume focusing solely on linguistic landscapes in a variety of diasporic contexts. In reviewing the literature on diaspora, I was reminded of my days as a graduate student reading discussions around the concept of diglossia, following Ferguson's classic 1959 definition and Fishman's 1967 expansion of that term. Am I dating myself here? Similarly, in the discussion, academic discussions around the concept of diaspora, originally narrowly referring to the dispersal of Jews from Judea in the 5th century BCE, were later expanded to include other population movements, the African diaspora during the slave trade, the Irish, Armenian, Chinese, Southeast Asian, and even the redneck and queer and digital diasporas. As was the case with diglossia a half a century ago, much of the discussion around diaspora has engaged in defining the referential boundaries of the phenomena. What are its necessary and sufficient characteristics? Is it theoretically useful construct? And if so, is there a diaspora linguistic landscape nexus? So today we'll explore 5 cases of diaspora through the prism of linguistic landscape. The first half hour, the authors of each of the 5 papers will present a 5-minute summary of their paper, highlighting what they'd like the audience to know about their study, its contributions to linguistic landscape studies, its relation to the theme, implications for the linguistic landscapes of diasporic communities, etc. And we'll do this in the order in which the papers appeared in the special issue, starting with Kristof, then Iair, then Samantha, Jannis, and Fengzhi. Their summaries will be timed, and the time will indicate when their time is up. We're going to try to stick to that as closely as we can. This will be followed by about a 10-minute response from each of the 2 discussants. First, Joey Santos, in case you don't know him, and Elana, who everybody knows. In this section, each discussant will give the audience their takeaways from the theme and content of the special issue, drawing on their own experiences with diaspora, either as researchers, as members of a diasporic community, or both. They might consider the collection as a whole or individual papers, but the focus will be on the special issues theme and the potential for exploring further the relationship between linguistic landscapes and diaspora. This will be followed by a 20-minute or so question and answer session and comments moderated by Robert, for those of you who are still with us. And the entire seminar or webinar should take about an hour and a half max. So let's begin with Kristof Savski from the Prince of Songkla University in Hat Yai, Thailand. Kristof?
Thank you, Thom. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so 5 minutes. Let me time myself as well. Okay. So my paper looks at the relationship between linguistic landscape and language policy in 2 spaces in the city where I'm working that Thom just mentioned, Hat Yai, which is in the south of Thailand, and sort of thinking about diaspora identity, but also other issues in that light. So here I'm using linguistic landscape as a traditional partner of language policy, partly because language policy is where I mostly work, but also because people like Elana, people like Androutsopoulous have sort of articulated that relationship very much in the past. And basically what I do is I draw kind of on the recent discursive and ethnographic work in language policy. These are kind of like big frameworks in that field now that haven't very much been discussed in relation to linguistic landscape. They sort of tend to be used more in kind of institutional settings like schools, and not so much in these, let's say, open discursive spaces that language policy tends to be studied in. So basically, I sort of look at, try to look at these issues a little bit in this light, try and understand this relationship a bit more. And looking at how policies try to modify basically the semiotic structure of space, how they try to achieve that, and where we can observe that in linguistic landscape. So the 2 spaces that I talk about, and I should say that my data here comes from 2 really great groups of undergraduate students who very kindly allowed me to reanalyze it after they had finished their work, that I'm very grateful to. The 2 spaces are, one is part of the commercial district in Hat Yai, and here the policy that I talk about is a sort of historic nationalist policy, a sort of assimilationist policy, which has quite successfully erased a big part of Chinese identity, not just in Hat Yai, but in many cities. In Thailand. Big contrast, for example, from Malaysia, for Singapore, for example, in Southeast Asian context. And here, basically, the signs that I analyze mainly, they show a lot of hybridity. There's a lot of inclusion of elements that index Chinese identity to some extent, but not overtly, not as overtly as it might be through the, let's say, use of language in general. So they tend to be sort of a lot of hybridity, a lot of use of elements that might index Chinese identity, but very mixed with many other sort of different types of indexical meanings. And then the other space that I talk about is a university space, not so much connected to diaspora. Here, looking at a more neoliberal policy of internationalization. This is in a university cafeteria, and basically focusing on how here we have a top-down imposition of English into a space where English is naturally maybe not quite present. So we see a big contrast between, let's say, the top-down signs where English is consistently always used, and the bottom-up signs where it occasionally appears, but is often absent or only partly present. So basically here, how to sort of look at this whole is basically the challenge here is trying to bring out agency in linguistic landscape, as the sort of recent policy frameworks have stressed, while still also looking at the structural effects of policy. This is a bit of a challenge because the concepts that the policy frameworks, the discursive policy frameworks offer are often, let's say, tied to very clear dissemination of policies, as might happen from, let's say, government to school district to school, which is not always easy to identify when we're talking about a linguistic landscape, a public space where we have many agents, many people possibly reacting to a policy, but possibly also just reacting to, broader discourses around language. So that is sort of closing with a kind of unsolved issue at the end of the paper, okay? I think that's my 4 minutes and 45 seconds summary, so I'll stop there. Thank you, Thom. Thom, unmute, Thom.
Thom, you're still muted.
There we go. Okay, sorry, you had some time left, but I used it. Okay, we're going to go straight through these, and then we'll have opportunities for discussing later. There's the sound. So you're next.
Thank you. And I have some slides to show, so maybe I'll share my screen. My paper deals with a very specific configuration in southern Israel, where Thai workers are employed as agriculture workers. And it's a specific region in south of Israel, which is mainly a desert area. Here we can see a satellite picture of the area, but it does have some greenhouse agriculture, and Thai workers are employed there and have their own diasporic existence there, which is not the main topic I'm going to discuss here. But one of the things I did in this study, I tried to compare the linguistic landscape and the vitality of the Thai language in two different times, in 2013 and in 2018-19. And what I found was very big difference between like over time, which is the main focus on, and also the main framework of my study. So the major findings were that in 2013, Thai was mainly used for warnings and prohibitions, so where it's absolutely necessary, but also when addressing Thai's purchasing power in shops, especially in the Thai grocery stores in this rural area. But by 2018, the presence of Thai was greatly reduced, and especially in functions that are not considered absolutely necessary. So for example, the welcome sign to one of the settlements that used to be in Hebrew, Thai, English, and Arabic changed during that time to Hebrew and English only, with no Thai and no Arabic. Also, places like the grocery store, at the entrance of the grocery store, where there were tons of signs about different products in Thai, and also with thank you message and so on. And these simply disappeared in 2019. The walls were barren, completely barren, with no linguistic landscape at all. And this also happened inside the shops. In some cases, there was an addition of English signs, and in some cases, some Hebrew, like here on the shelves. And of course, there were Thai still could be found on signs that dealt with warnings or very special purposes. But the main question is that I asked is, why is Thai slowly disappearing from the linguistic landscape of the region? Because we know for a fact that the number of Thais there hasn't been reduced. Actually, it increased during this time period. So to understand this, there is a very complex set of all the different players and their interests in the region. But if we focus on the farm owners, which are the business owners, basically, they are constantly looking for alternatives to the Thai workers. They have all kinds of volunteering programs, trainee programs, and so on, that are meant to somehow replace Thai migrant workers. And one of them is the trainee program, which has over 1,000 trainees every year in the region, coming from various countries, including Thailand. They come for a 10-month program, and the main motto there is learning by doing, which means they are actually workers there as well as students. So in fact, they are some kind of a new unregulated category of workers. And it's very interesting. Here you can see their distribution according to different countries of origin. And there is some branding there. You can see they have a logo, and they have places where students showcase their work to visitors and so on. So what is it? What is actually going on in this region? Why is Thai disappearing? So the main reason is that farm owners tend to prefer unregulated labor. They tend to prefer informal labor economy, where there is less regulation, they don't need to pay a lot, and so on. And this has driven farmers to look for alternatives. And Thai workers are no longer seen as the most important group of workers, even though their number hasn't changed much. And there are all kinds of, I know I'm out of time, so I think that's enough, but there are some interesting paradoxes. For example, the fact that the Thai workers are still there, but they are simply ignored. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the time went off, except I was muted, so you couldn't hear it.
Oh, sorry.
I had to correct that. Okay, and next we have Samantha, and excuse me, Samantha, for mispronouncing your name, Zhan.
Zhan, yeah, thank you.
From the University of Sydney. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I prepared a few slides too. So the title of our paper is a change and continuity in Hurstville's Chinese restaurants. So it is an ethnographic area study in Sydney, and I'm presenting also for my co-author Wei Wang. And the study is carried out in Hurstville. So it is a suburb 16 kilometers south of Sydney CBD and home to the largest Chinese community in Sydney, with almost half of its residents reporting Chinese heritage. And this study was inspired by linguistic landscape research in Chinatowns around the world, where the Chinese language and culture are used symbolically in the commodification of Chinatown for the satisfaction of non-readers of Chinese. But Hurstville is where the real Chinese community resides. We believe would reveal different Chinese needs, so contribute to the knowledge of Chinese diaspora. And this Google Street View screenshots on this page shows out the sites, the main shopping street in Hurstville. So this is a suburban area with low-rise buildings on both sides of the streets, and shops cover various services, including the Chinese restaurants we talked about. And this theoretical foundation, including the ethnographic linguistic landscape analysis ELA by Blomerk and Meili, and science point towards their past, future, presence, and past refer to the origin and modes of production, and future refer to the intended audience and the preferred uptake, and present refer to emplacements, which is also part of the plate semiotics, including in Scolan's geosemiotics. And by the Scolan's framework, we focus on mainly on visual semiotics and plate semiotics. And our data include photographs, and another important source is Google Street Review as an linguistic landscape archive, and also ethnographic data featuring structured interview and informal conversation and observations, because I lived in the suburb for 3 years, and I'm still living very close to that suburban area. And this, with the data and the historical and social perspective, our analysis can be divided into 2 parts. The first is a retrospective comparison of the restaurant scape in Hurstville, 2009 versus 2019. And we also did an ELA case study of a long-standing Chinese restaurants in Hurstville. And here we use Google Map as a tool to map the Chinese restaurants. On the base map of Google provided, multiple layers can be added to organize a different feature, and we use it to organize the different years. So on this layer, these numbers 1 to 29 indicates paint the exact location of all 29 Chinese restaurants in 2019. And so this is another layer on top of this one. This reflects what's the restaurant scape is like back in 2009. So this symbols stand for what the 29 premises were back in 2009. So there was some like radical changes. Only 6 restaurants like survived through 2009 to 2019. In addition to the change, we found that the Chinese was the preferred language on the shopfront signs of the Chinese restaurants in both years, and the use of traditional Chinese characters was more prevalent 10 years ago. And we noticed substantially less variety in their origins of regional cuisines of Chinese cuisine, such as Cantonese, Shanghai, Sichuan. And despite more variety of regional cuisines, Cantonese cuisine still has a very strong dominance even now in the restaurant scape in Hurstville. Sorry. And we also did a ELA case study following the past, present, and future dimensions, and as a part of the social, cultural, and historical phenomenon. And we found the linguistic landscape as subject to historically and socially stratified, and multiple contexts and multiple history of different temporalities operate at the same time. and I'll finish quite soon. So this is related to the history of Chinese restaurants, Cantonese cuisine, the food it offers, and the neon signs that reminds of Hong Kong. And these religious artifacts remind us that most Chinese, if they believe in any religion, they often believe in multiple spiritual figures instead of one religion. So these religious artifacts include Buddhism and includes the Chinese mythology, and also the fortune cats represents part of the Japanese culture, and this wood is part of the wooden architects. The decoration is part of Chinese 5 elements in yang. And by talking about emplacements, so this picture of the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, they actually came here for to like advertise for their electoral campaign. So this political photograph was recontextualized into this commercial presenting advertisement corner of this restaurant to present the authenticity of their cuisine. So this restaurant is actually a like a synchronic shot of multiple histories and related to multiple locations. Yeah, I didn't time, so sorry for the timing. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Samantha. And by the way, I should remind people who haven't read her paper that it is very, very rich in data. So if you want to explore some of those things, you can go back to her paper. Next is Jannis from the University of Hamburg. So are you ready to go, Jannis? Is he ready? Hello?
Yeah,
Jannis
all right.
All
right now. Thank you, Thom, for including us into this special issue. We did this paper the summer before the pandemic, while Accra Shoshong, who couldn't be here today, that's why I'm jumping in at his place, while he was still a doctoral student of mine with me in Hamburg. Now he's back at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. So basically what we did is that Accra, who's a native Thai, went around Hamburg photographing signs both outside and inside Thai restaurants, and he covered a lot of them, and we did a small corpus of around 200 signs from 12 restaurants. And we started out looking at the forms of functions of Thai language and Thai script. So what is the role of Thai in Thai restaurants and outside Thai restaurants in basically authenticating what these Thai restaurants have to offer, authenticating, creating ambience. These are the thoughts we began with. Then we focused a little bit on the difference between inside and outside space. That's something that Samantha showed as well just a minute ago. And we basically found out that there is more of visibility and more of a display of Thai signs, especially in the Thai script, in the inside space. So from the moment that customers have decided to engage with a restaurant and spend time and money there. And we also asked about the role of different sign genres for the display of Thai. Now, what we developed in the course of the analysis, which I still find useful as a sort of a descriptive grid, especially with doing restaurants and other such spaces that are semi-public and have an inside and outside space, we developed this little classification grid where we distinguish between primary storefront signs. These are the main signs that usually are covered in linguistic landscape studies. And then these are distinguished from secondary storefront signs. So these are the little signs that advertise opening hours or have warnings or stuff like that. And then we have primary in-store signs, the menu cards, and secondary in-store signs, things like the wardrobe signs and toilet signs and things like that. Now, there's one aspect, I have examples for the rest. There's one aspect of these observations and the data we collected that's not really worked out very well in the paper, and I apologize. No, I don't apologize for that, Thom, but it's something that I realized later on after having done the study. it's a distinction between ethnic and diasporic that I think it's interesting to the discussion here. So one way to understand ethnic, like in ethnic restaurants, it's something that is showcasing and selling cultural heritage for a mainstream audience. Think of ethnic music, ethnic clothing, ethnic fashion, ethnic restaurants. Now, diasporic as a concept differs in that it entails transnational mobility. Diasporic practices are transnational mobile practices, and Thom, you're writing about that in the introduction to a special issue in some detail. Now, diasporic practices can be connected with ethnic marketing, but not necessarily so. Now, this plays out in this data that we collected in the sense that some of them are ethnic in the sense of being marketing instruments, and some offer diasporic traces. And I have three types of signs that are so traces of diasporic mobility encased and contextualized within an ethnic marketing scheme, maybe you could say. One of them are these secondary signs, outside and in store. These are not the main sign with a name on the offer, but these are signs like welcome signs with this Y gesture, the welcome signs, and this is another welcome sign, and this is a toilet sign, and this is a sign to put off your shoes. Now, all of these signs are imported from Thailand, are not made in Germany. The main signs are made in Germany. Of course, the Thai language has to be right, but these signs are imported from Thailand. So Accra Shoshong knows about this, and he talked with the restaurant owners about this. And what strikes me with these secondary signs that are traces of diasporic mobility of the shop owners or the importers are that all of them are bimodal or bilingual, and bimodal bilingual. And by this capacity, they can be understood both at a communicative level and at a symbolic level, as it were. So they can be understood communicatively because of the two languages and because of the pictograms. And they can also be understood as authenticating, offering more indexicals of Thainess to authenticate the place. A second type of diasporic trace are certain sections of the menu. Now, the Y sign is, of course, important, and this Y sign becomes an emblem in anthropological terms of Thainess due to its repetition in different portions of the semiotic landscapes of the restaurants. A second type, and I won't keep you long, are certain portions of the menus. Now, as we found out, these menus differ a great deal, and they are richly multilingual. So what you see to the left is typical for low-budget restaurants. So there might be some Latinized Thai, but it's mainly in German. And the higher-up restaurants, they are more, so they take more care to use the different languages in authenticating and in providing more detail about the stuff. So you see here, you have different combinations of English and German and Thai in Thai script. Certain restaurants, I think a couple of them, have sections like this to the right. They have pages that are entirely Thai, okay? And so Accra went into restaurants and talked to the owners about it, and they said, well, we have Thai people. We have some Thai people who live in Hamburg and don't speak German. These are a minority among the immigrants. But we have mobile people, and they come here or they are brought here and they want to eat real Thai food. So these are, in a sense, the sections of the menu that do not address the mainstream consumers and the mainstream society consumers, but rather the a more mobile portion of the consumers. The third type of diasporic traces are these anointments. So these are the signs that are left after the, how do you say, the holy ceremony. This is the inauguration ceremony of the shop, and there you have the Buddhist community and a priest who gather together and they anoint these signs, and you find them both outside but especially inside. And unlike all the others, these are only in Thai. So these are portions of the linguistic landscape that are inward looking. They're not selling anything. They're authenticating for the outsiders but have a religious meaning for the insiders. Okay, I think so. That's the point, that we have within this ethnic ensemble of the restaurants, we have some diasporic traces. Maybe I can bring this down to that phrase. And here's another one. And just to finish off with a bit of advertising for the next Linguistic Landscape workshop that's coming up in September in Hamburg, focusing on schoolscapes, linguistic landscapes, and educational spaces. And I'll put the website where you can find the call for papers and things like that into the chat. And thanks for this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jannis. That was an interesting addition that you didn't have in the paper. That's really fun. And finally, Fengzhi, Zhao from where? From the University of London. I'm sorry. So yeah, you're on.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning from London. Thank you for your interest in our sharing, and many thanks to Thom, Robert, and Elana for organizing this webinar across the globe. As to my paper, it is about how newly arrived Chinese immigrants make sense of Operation Chinatown through its linguistic landscape. Drawing upon the analysis of 130 photographs of the field. Sorry, can I just remind everybody to mute themselves? Sorry. Yeah, drawing upon the analysis of 130 photographs of the field and in-depth interviews with 4 newly settled migrants from China, I argue that the linguistic landscape of the Parisian Chinatown has constructed a coherent discursive frame for the newcomers to the diaspora community who come to make sense of the place as a identifiable, relational, and historical space. My research, in a sense, has accentuated the material agency of linguistic landscape in terms of how it shapes and structures the spatial and social experiences of people. My analysis demonstrates that people's interpretation and sense-making of linguistic landscape is essentially the way they come to engage with space and people. Specifically, in case of Chinatown as a diasporic space, it depicts how new members to the diasporic group come to engage with the imagined community embodied in a concrete community space through its linguistic landscape. On the spatial level, the semiotic affordances of the linguistic landscape in this ethnic enclave not only remarks and establishes the boundary of it as a diasporic space, but also contributes to the cognitive mapping of it as a Chinatown for the newcomers. On the social level, thanks to the relative transparency of written scripts and signs compared with spoken encounters, which involve social cause and different linguistic variations, the linguistic landscape of the Parisian Chinatown has helped the newcomers to transcend the in-group differences within the Chinese diaspora, orient them in the space, and in this sense, facilitate their engagement and alignments with the diasporic community. My concern with the newly arrived immigrants has also implicated the consideration of the diversified diasporic experiences and circumstances in future linguistic landscape studies on diaspora, as the concept of diaspora has gone far beyond its original reference. We may arguably understand it informed by Thom's reference to Birkbeck's 2005 work in the introduction to the special issue, as people on the move marked by homeland orientation and boundary maintenance. So the inquiry into diaspora is not necessarily only about stable, long-term, even multi-generational residents, but also about people who got dispersed for relatively temporary reasons, such as international students, expatriates, migrant workers, etc. Because what they encounter and experience in a new social and cultural setting is by nature also diasporic. Therefore, by considering people's diversified diasporic experiences and circumstances, linguistic landscape studies, I think, could have much to offer to understand with precision how diasporic individuals come to keep their homeland orientation and maintain the invisible boundaries in their everyday life. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That's a wonderful segue to the discussion. In the discussion session, I tried I want to turn off the timer so you during the discussion, I tried to arrange to have one newcomer to the field, one kind of mid-career person, and one veteran. Well, the mid-career and veteran couldn't make it with us today, and instead we have the veteran Elana. We have a newcomer, relatively speaking. I hope you don't mind my saying that, Joey. Joey Santos, who just finished his PhD from Chula and now has an academic position at King Mongkut University of Technology in Hungary. So, Joey, you want to give us your takeaways?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Thom, Professor Elana, and Professor Robert for the invitation. This is actually quite interesting for me, particularly as I participated in that conference. For me, the special issue of the Linguistic Landscape Journal on the theme Diaspora and Asian Spaces in Transnational World covers significant issues situated in various contexts: university setting, public commercial places, farming areas, and tourism spaces. The findings yielded from vast analytical and methodological tools and techniques unveil discursive practices of cultural and national identity construction and social injustices illuminating from linguistic and semiotic configurations. As a migrant myself, then as a student, and now as a researcher, I face the issues in question at a certain degree. Perhaps a person who is not proficient in the language of the country I reside, I can't help but find myself in the center of clashing ideology, social issues, and linguistic conflicts. And I emphasize that my inadequacy in the language leaves me unaware or unable to grasp the said concerns. So this brings me to the 2019 Linguistic Landscape Workshop theme, which is East meets West, Social Reflections and Integration, the conference where the articles in this issue were actually chosen. I must say that the collection has successfully captured its aims through the empirical soundness of the paper. But to continue, allow me to frame this based on my itinerary as a migrant student and a researcher, focusing first on the university, tourism spaces, then down to the last point. University spaces have been my home in the past 4 years, and perhaps Savski interrogated 2 case studies in the southern region of Thailand where I actually stay with my friends. And in his study, he unveiled the relationship of language policy and linguistic landscape, which is a contested and a nexus of negotiation. His study clearly showed the erasure of certain languages and maintenance of preferred languages as being part of the language policy. Thus, the study also demonstrated how semiotics are strategically used to infuse cultural heritage. And tourism probably is one of the most investigated sites of the diaspora. There you can experience the aggregate of cultural experience. Chinatown, for example, is one of the highly investigated tourism area. So in this collection, Zhao's paper demonstrated how LL as a discursive frame serves as a salient cultural apparatus that does not only reference spatial and social practices, but also informs us about people's places in space and their relationship with them. Her analysis clearly articulated how LL signs coherently map out our experiences vis-a-vis the places that we are in. And perhaps in tourism spaces, you'll never forget restaurants, particularly covering gastronomic discourses. In the gastronomic discourses through signs illustrate rich cultural configurations which are explicated by the Androutsopoulous and Chaokung and Zhan and Wang's works. The insights offered by a multimodal genre analysis does not only gives serious attention to the communicative purpose and the discursive function of the signs, but also the strategic compliance with policies and preservation and I quote, negotiation of cultural identity. Particularly, the primary signs exhibited the compliance with the language policy, while the secondary signs are used to construct an authentic cultural experience. Zhan, Zhu, and Wang captured the timescales as reflected in the signs and demonstrated how semiotic resources are employed to manifest Chinese culture stemming from traditional practices. And these two papers put to the core the rich properties and opportunities of linguistic and semiotic resources to project historical bodies. These issues are some of the things that I have experienced as a migrant student and researcher. Through the study, I become cognizant of other topics, which for some may be perceived as normal or rather mundane, but we cannot deny the fact that they are imbricated with complex issue and thus require scholarly attention to unpack the negotiation of cultural identities. Perhaps what caught my attention is Iair's study, which provided a thought-provoking analysis of the LL sign, which unraveled issues of injustices and inequality, which impacted informal workers and favored certain institutions. The most interesting findings for me is how perception, which could be wrong or inarguably carry vested self-interests, feeds injustices and exploitation. This, as for me, is salient as these issues seem to rest in the periphery. To this end, I'd like to share my personal reflection as a researcher and as a migrant myself. As a researcher, I see the role of LL in the real world. It positions language choices and semiotic resources as not only a tool nor instrument for communication, but represents a wider human practice and experience. In that human practice and experience lie conflicts that are situated and even contextualized in spaces. This brings challenges to the future researchers to take a microscopic take on issues surrounding us, specifically on diaspora human mobility and their interaction with diverse factors, which can be systemically configured through science and infrastructures. I also believe that there is a need to extend our focus to regional and rural discourses as though they could be put to the fore. Moreover, the digital tools such as QR code impacts or seems to impact physical spaces and thus may need closer examination. In doing so, I would end that I think there is an imperative need to put forward even more innovative methodological and analytical approaches to provide sound answers to these complex real-world issues. And thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Joey. As always, excellent. And now, Elana, who probably doesn't need more of an introduction than that, I hope. You're muted, Elana. You have to turn your microphone on. It's
PowerPoint. You have the PowerPoint, Robert? Yes, it's on.
Your microphone is on now, yeah.
Microphone is okay, and okay. And in the meantime, I just wanted to welcome you all. I didn't have a chance to say it at the beginning, but I'm really very happy you're all here, and not all, but at least 70, what we said, 59 people by now. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to get together and hear issues which are so interesting. The papers were fantastic and the presentations today were so good. And it's very difficult to say anything that is kind of critical because they were all very, very good. And Joy's presentation was excellent in terms of summarizing it. Just last night we heard the two other discussants cannot make it. So I volunteered or was asked to do this introduction, and I thought it's a discussion. And I thought it was such a good opportunity for me to do it because of so many things I know, but had I known and I had more time, I'm sure I could have continued this a bit more. But more than anything else, I wanted to say something that the example of today, a 90-minute webinar is an example. It's something that we can think of for the future. So on behalf of Robert and myself, we are really calling for others to come up with ideas like this. I mean, not only because of the pandemic, but the fact that really because of the pandemic, maybe we don't get to see each other in person at all. And this is not person, but at least we have some contact with one another. So it doesn't have to be a special issue. Just if you have an idea even of something that is a theme that you think is very important and you have some research you could put together, just let us know and we'll help you or do it for you, organize what we've done for today. And you could see one is San Francisco, one is in Liverpool, one is in Tel Aviv, but we were very easily, not easily always, but very, very happy to do it and also deal with all the challenges of cancellations, but to see that the life still goes on. And the personal communication, even via Zoom, is very important. So please approach us if you have any idea for putting together something like this webinar. So, and also, so I want to start by really thanking Thom for putting together the whole meeting in Bangkok, which was really fantastic. And we didn't even think that that will be the personal one that the last personal meeting really. So thank you, Thom. And reading your introduction, it was mentioned by a few people, but I think especially by Jannis, it's really fantastic. I read it again last night when I had to do this discussion. And it's really something very, very deep in terms of diaspora. And of course, Asian spaces as well. But I think what I would like to a little bit focus on is the whole issue of diaspora, which was kind of superimposed after the thing when we needed a title for everything together. But I think you did a great job for us people in linguistic landscape to try to think about it in meaningful ways and the complexities of diaspora. So I'll just look in a very short time, of course, a few aspects of that, because I think diaspora is so much bigger than what we think of. So I start by a quote that actually was in Thom's introduction, where he quotes some government offices talking about diaspora. It can be, I mean, anything. So from diaspora is as if everything to really what's happening now is looking at diaspora as a complex issue, critical work, rethinking, especially in terms of human rights, social justice, immigrants, refugees, and the type of impact with home communities, which I don't think we heard much in this paper about relationship between diaspora and home communities, which is a whole new topic that I'm sure you're aware of. So that's something that could have been, I'm just thinking now about the future, really. Where else can we go with a topic like this? Then is the issue of, does LL research in diaspora leads us to new understanding of diasporic phenomena beyond research of language maintenance? We've done lots of language maintenance in the SLA research of people, immigrants, that diaspora, whatever, how we call them. Although, as I'm saying now, the terms are much more complexified now. Diaspora is not just immigrants. There are some issues which are common, some issues which are not, because the diaspora being a close relationship oftentimes with the home country and vice versa in all kinds of issues, economic, political. I mean, people say that what happened, the revolution in, not a revolution, but kind of going apart between Czechoslovakia was all because of Czech diaspora, people who were the diaspora, and they created the change from diaspora. So the relationship with the home country is very, very important. I don't think we had too many of those papers in this issue, but I think it's a way to go. Another point is point 3, do the papers that we heard today confirm what we already know about migrant communities and their diversity, and or do they raise new issues? Oftentimes, I think that the main issue, and I liked what said about the whole issue of linguistic landscape is a human act, and I think it is a human act. But oftentimes we look at it as, and I'll give you a quote even from Thom's paper, as another thing in a toolbox. So the question I'm asking in 3 is, from the findings we found in this collection of papers, can we think about something more than that? Can we learn something? I think the paper of Iair is a good example, because we didn't know about the overlooking, ignoring the local Thai community. And by looking at those signs, which are so striking before and after, the signs tell you that something is happening there that nobody had ever thought about or nobody had seen before. So that's an example of point 3. And point 4, sorry for skipping, how do these papers using LL and semiotics, and I think most papers, almost all papers uses semiotics as well, lead us to new depth and new findings of the uniqueness of certain types of diasporic communities. And to add to that, we're talking about so many types of diasporic communities. Most of the time, point 6, multiple issues, multiple methodologies, and the issue of marginality, because most diasporic, especially in the nation state idea, the diasporic communities are not really the people who we view as mainstream in nation state countries. They're always marginal, they're always somewhere else. They're always those that people always ask, where are you from? You're never really accepted fully. So I think these are issues of marginality need to be examined. I mean, the Thai example that Iair brought, other examples, I think were very, very much in point that these people are not really, even the Thai people in Paris, I mean, it's not really the people that we can think of, Chinese, sorry, in new findings. So I think we have to look at point 6. We have to multiple issues, multiple ideologies. The issue of marginality is major here, but not much. We haven't done much about justice and activism to use LL for change, which I am very much looking at it always. And I'd like you to, and I'd like, can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, this is what from Thom's introduction that I already mentioned. Altogether, they suggest that attention to the core constituent elements of diasporic situations only deepens analysis of LL, and that consideration of the LL can in turn serve as an additional tool in the diaspora studies toolbox. So that's the question I'm asking, whether it's just another tool, whether it's a whole construct in itself, whether it's a finding that we can never get to before without doing linguistic landscape. And so I think these are issues we have to think about. What do we mean? What is this? What does linguistic landscape really add to what we know, what we have learned already in diaspora? And there's so many theories about it and so on. Can you come to the next one and I'll finish there? Okay, thank you. So we say here, is that the one? Oh, is that the same one?
It was earlier.
It's the earlier one. Oh, again, the earlier one. This I don't see. Okay, here. So my view is that the topic of diaspora is not stressed enough in the issue. And I know also as from Thom, we had to kind of talk about what does it mean in terms of diaspora. And I think we really should go ahead with maybe another issue about more the issue of diaspora there. Diaspora is always type of marginality, I already said that, and away from the norm. We need to think of how diasporic can be transformed to having an impact on societies. And the example in these papers, there is a focus on periphery, restaurants, meetings of groups, people from diaspora, and changes of attitude of the regime, marginalization and abuse. These papers contributed issues of border areas, mixture of languages, but all cases, it is clear who is in power and who is not. Can research in LL be emphasizing a bit some of these inequalities? I wanted to mention also another point missing also how they can contribute to the societies. How does diaspora contribute? And I wanted to give you an example here. I'm almost done, Thom. Example of one of our students. His name is Adam Ahmed. He's from Sudan. And he's Sudanese refugee living in Israel, and they are very marginalized in Israel, really as refugees and asylum seekers in Israel, to revive an oral language that is forbidden to be used in Sudan, inventing a new writing system and teach the new generation the writing system and the language of this language that is not allowed to be spoken in Sudan itself. It's a minority language, And they are taking a role of creating this language and its use and knowledge while being in Israel, where nobody cares if they use it. It's not marginalized in Israel. And so they do this kind of thing. So I wanted to look again about what I said before, the relationship between the contribution of diaspora to home communities and also to the local community in Israel, the fact that they're doing something like that. So, okay, to end almost, the strength of diaspora is helping teaching local communities and their ability to influence home countries. That's in his example. What type of LL can be used for such goals? The issues and the title encourage us to expansion of the issues of LL and how to do it. Thank you very much.
Can I just want to say, first of all, to the 5 presenters, thank you so much, because I know that it was very difficult to kind of condense your own work into a 20-minute presentation at the conference, and then you have to do it again and condense it even further to a 5-minute presentation here, and you've all done such a wonderful job and added new stuff to your studies, new insights that you maybe gained as afterwards. I want to thank Joey for the fantastic job you did. I knew you were going to do a great job, and you did, especially relating it to your own personal experiences as a foreign student in a country in which you are illiterate, in a country in which you are illiterate in the language of that country. And then also Elana, I mean, who's going to stop her after 10 minutes, right? So thank you all. And now Robert is going to open the floor for questions and comments.
Thank you. We still have time. I'm going to just associate myself with Tom's comments. Thank you all the presenters for their really interesting contributions today. We do have some time for question and answer, so feel free either just to raise your hand and I'll bring you in, or you can use the Q&A function or the chat function, whichever suits you best. Now I'm waiting to see whether. Ah, yeah. So Christiane Alexandra.
Yeah.
Oh, not Tom. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, and thank you for giving me the floor this morning, and thank you for this very interesting session. I am a student at the University of Kiel in Germany, and I'm working on LL actually for my PhD. This is LL in Cameroon precisely, and. Yeah, my question goes to Iair. I was very, very much interested in his paper and his talk, but unfortunately, due to time constraint, I couldn't get the relationship he established between the informal labor and the change in the LL of the community he's investigating. So please, Iair, could you expatiate a little bit on that?
Yes, thank you. So I will say generally that Elana, Shohamy, and I wrote actually a paper about these, media coverage of these issues, because these are indeed very complex issues with a lot of different players and interests and dynamics. But generally speaking, like many business owners, the farmer owners in the region prefer to have less regulation. And of course, they prefer to have workers they don't need to pay social rights and more salary and more taxes and so on. So this is why they tend to favor other types of workers, which are not really workers. They're not even called workers. They're called volunteers, they're called trainees, and so on. And this is for them a way of getting some labor, some people working for them, but without actually going through all the official process, which is costly and which they don't like. And this is what I think is really the core of what's going on there.
Right. So it is the change in the nature of their worker or the origin of their workers that brings in the change in their LL, right? If I get you well. All right. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. They tend to favor some workers over other workers. Yeah, this is the main issue there.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you both. So a question from Svetlana Leonavsky to the entire panel is really, how do you define the studies of linguistic landscapes separated in time but conducted in the same place? So this is a question, I think, about diachronic studies. And Samantha, can you tackle that first about how do you define studies separated over time?
Oh, studies separated. Can I clarify a little bit? This is studies meaning my own studies or like linguistic landscape studies?
Well,
overall.
I conducted the study separated. Well, I had the 4 takes in the same street, for example, at the wartime in Ukraine. And when I defined my study as synchronic, because I did like 4 regions of Ukraine at 2, 3, 4 different times. And when I defined them as synchronic and diachronic studies, I had big eyes and big questions from linguistic community, because of course they disagree. To them, those terms mean different things. And I was arguing that diachronic does not mean separated by centuries. It's just basically the good way to define when you repeat the same take of the linguistic science. And what do you think? Any arguments that you can help me with so I can win this linguistic battle?
Yeah, sorry, are you happy to take that, Samantha? How do you view diachronic from your own perspective?
Yeah, because what I am a little bit sensitive to the words historical and diachronic as well. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I am a little sensitive to the word diachronic and historical, and I was afraid I'm going to be challenged. It's not a diachronic study, or it's not a historical enough. By what I do in my own study is I kind of view the different photograph sessions I did as static and only representative of when I did that session. But by comparing them, by looking at these different photo sessions and different like provoking the histories behind what causes this linguistic landscape, what caused this static linguistic landscape to come into being, we are looking at histories and we are looking at what happens before that context became into a context we are examining at that time. So I am very much agreeing or a fan of Blomek's work in terms of the historical perspective, that it's layered, it's historical stratified, and it's called simultaneous, layered simultaneity.
Yes.
So yeah, we could look at what happens before and what's happening on different time scales. Some remain very stable because something remain very stable on a longer time scale, and something like the changes we could observe and we could sense was kind of the shorter term history we are talking about. So yeah, something is always more stable than than others. So that's the kind of historical perspective I'm taking towards my own study.
What do you call this perspective? You know, do you define it as diachronic, or do you have a better term so we don't clash with linguists all the time? You know, because I see in the article that it's ready to go into the issue on Odessa. Odessa in Ukraine, the southern city, very dynamic, and because of the language policy that is changing during the war. So there is a critical junction where institutions come in and they demand very dramatic changes in the landscape. And so I do call it, I do synchronic investigations, but when I put it, since I've repeated exactly the same places, I know the first house, I know the last house, I know all the shops, I know where they went.
Yeah.
So what, and the Iair also did this with the signage and repeating it at the same places. So what would you guys say? Please help me out. I don't know.
Yeah, this is quite a big topic, and I'm just conscious that we maybe other questions. So Svetlana, can we possibly take this offline?
Yes, sorry about it. I was just like waiting for please. Okay.
Does anybody else want to come in on the diachronic study, or are there other questions that for the panel? So could I possibly, just to sort of whet the appetite, can I ask the various authors of the contributions how their thinking has changed as a consequence? Because of course you presented your papers as individuals and you've now found yourself sort of coalesced around an idea of diaspora, and you've seen the other contributions of that. I wonder, is there anything in particular you've seen that will help, inform future work around diaspora based on, how you found yourself within this special issue? Who wants to go first? Jannis, is there anything that's grabbed you around sort of moving this forward? Sorry to put this on you.
As I said, yes, Robert, as I said, Tom's introduction and the focus on diaspora in conjunction with other work of mine on digital multilingualism, not related to the linguistic landscape, have indeed made me more sensitive, not just to diasporic practices, but to the conceptual and practical distinctions between ethnic, migrant, and diasporic. I think this is something that is useful to have conceptually, theoretically, and also that sort of impacts and leaves imprints on the semiotic landscape. Not everything that is heteroglossic is by definition diasporic. I think that diaspora is really really entails mobility, really entails exchanges and orientations and engagements with discourses and with in other spaces, in heritage spaces. And the notion of migrant does not necessarily entail this mobility, although many migrants participate in diasporic practices and engagements. So yes, even after writing the paper, I think there is the special issue helped me gain more awareness of these distinctions and their implications for analysis, I think.
Great, thank you. Fengzhi, did you want to come in at that stage as well? Because of course I know you've done a lot of thinking around this.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for bringing it out as a question, Robert. Actually, through my by preparing this talk, I was I kept reflecting what has been changed throughout from the very beginning of my study on Chinatown till now, because it had this research is originated in my master dissertation, which is 5 years ago. So I would say I didn't kind of frame it under the concept of diaspora very much, but by reading other colleagues' paper and Thom's wonderful summary of the concept and all the articles, I start to realize, as I said, the diversified diasporic experiences is a very interesting topic and probably relevant to many big topics under globalization, especially if we consider people on the move with very with mobility, and maybe we can examine them because I think the benefit of diaspora is really like how it is different from migrants or other terms. I think it has implicated the kind of homeland orientation and boundary maintenance. I think they are very interesting aspects to think about, like how we can manage to connect them with identity or something. So what I'm thinking, we're probably talking about my future research. I was quite, especially during the using my own personal experience as the Chinese student, getting dispersed, kind of living as a diasporic individual in UK, because it is not very convenient for us to return to my country. I haven't been home for 3 years, so I would say maybe I'm thinking really like envisioning a study on the diaspora, how like Chinese students living in UK as a diaspora, and I'm sure there must be something very interesting to be looked at there. Thank you.
Can I?
Thank you. Yeah, Thom.
Yeah, I just wanted to, as you were all talking, and I thought of something while Elana was talking when she talked about the relationship between the diaspora community and the homeland. And I don't know if you're all familiar with Raphael's paper, but that's exactly what they do. They look at the diaspora community in Paris and then back in Israel. So if that's the topic of interest, there's a good example there.
Thanks, Thom. Kristof or Iair or yeah, I think they're the only two not talking, or even Joey. Do any of you want to come in on this idea of where you've moved to?
I think yeah.
Oh, sorry, Joey, go ahead. Don't worry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're both too polite. That's the I think I don't know, like my paper probably was the sort of the most difficult to sort of fit into the diaspora theme, because really only half of it sort of worked with that. But I mean, but that's to me is in general, as the whole topic of Chinese diaspora in Thailand, that's very interesting, and it sort of continues to strike me how much this is really a non-identity often, where it's sort of it's sort of avoided as an identity. It's almost morphed into an identity almost of social class, where certain elements of Chineseness might index almost like a kind of middle class identity. That's at least my reading. Maybe I'm completely off, but that's my sense. So yeah, that was sort of, yeah, that's kind of has struck me since, and probably I thought of that as something that I might have written about a bit more.
Thanks, Kristof. Joey, did you want to come in at that point?
Yeah, I think after reading all the papers, because I'm currently working on transitory sex workers, like those migrant sex workers, and reading all the papers give me so much reflections on how should I plan the work, how should I do it, and even Or's work on farming. That reminds me of the project I'm currently undertaking on farm to table discourses. It gives me that caution on, as an outsider myself, how can I actually enter the field and interpret these issues correctly? Because it's not only Thai people who are in these industry. There could be Burmese individuals or even Vietnamese. So I think the main takeaway is to really be very cautious and be very careful in the analytical tools, just so I don't overread them, and also to understand certain things that I can and cannot touch. So I think that's a very important takeaway for me.
Right, yeah. Was there anything for you wanted to add?
maybe I just say that my paper, I think my paper was a bit unusual because it was like a mystery I had to solve. I didn't know in advance what my methodology and what my argument was going to be. So it's a bit more like what Carlo Ginzburg called detective work. I was a detective and I tried to solve this mystery. But in hindsight, I think there are some very interesting tools that I would like to use in the future. For example, the comparison between different time frames. And today with Google Street View, we sometimes can even see 3 different shots of the same place on Google Street View. And we see that the businesses have changed, signs have changed. So I think this has a lot of potential, not just for immigration and diaspora, but generally for LL studies. Diaspora is also another topic that I would like to pursue because it's, I see that there is a lot of, like Elana mentioned, a lot of contact with home communities and a lot of things going on all the time. So it's very interesting to try to track these using LL.
Thank you very much indeed, Iair, and all of you. There's time for probably Ute, yeah.
I just wanted to add a few comments, just pick up on a couple of points that people said because they seemed so interesting and relevant. And I haven't done much LL research in a long time, so it's really nice. Also, just wanted to say it's really nice to be here and listen to all these really interesting talks. I thought about the point about that we need to look at the home communities or not just the incomers, and that made me remember and think again about how there is the element of trying to understand how people who live in the spaces, and that could be the locals, how they perceive signs, and the methodological issue of having to do some kind of reception study and which I haven't done when I long time ago did that work in Berlin because I found it really difficult. And I still think that's something that LL research might want to do a little bit more. I'm probably doing injustice to people there because I suspect there are people who have done that research by now and I just haven't read it because I haven't followed up on things. But I think that remains a really, really important thing to do. And specifically, if we want to understand better how the locals perceive the signs in different languages. And related to this, the question of, I think it was Elana who said that the intersection with class. While I was thinking about where I live here in Lancaster, which is a reasonably boring, smallish, middle-sized town in the northwest of England, but there are diasporic communities. There are, people from other countries who have been living here, and I think there's definitely, a strong thing here that has to relate to class. Both actually, different kind of class. They are the kind of more, well, think about people like me. There's a bunch of academics, middle-class academics from European countries living here who leave their marks on the linguistic landscape somewhere, I bet. But then, there are others, for example, from Eastern European countries, and the class issue is important because it also intersects with local class issues. The Northwest here, for example, is a pretty economically underdeveloped, tough region. There's a lot of poverty here in the local community as well. So that would be really interesting and I think very useful to see. And it's all kind of visible in the linguistic landscape.
Great, thank you very much, Ruchi. That's a really helpful synthesis of the whole talk. So thank you very much for bringing that all together at the end. There are just moments to go before the end. And Elana is going to draw us to say sort of farewell. But does anyone on the panel have anything they want to add to that? Or can we move to our farewells and bedtime for some or the working day for others? No, I'll hand straight over to Elana. Thank you, Elana.
I just want to say to go on Uta's thing. I mean, and I've heard so many papers when we talk about diaspora about workers who move from one place to another. I mean, how much are they a diaspora with the intention, yeah, we'll come here like the Filipino workers and so on. And I think these people are diaspora in a very new definition, kind of a postmodern definition, I mean, which we see. And I heard a paper by Kelly a few years ago about guest workers in other places, and also in Turkey, Kurds working in Turkey, and it's like these conflicts people are going with. I think it's much, this is what I wanted, what I meant, why it's so much more complicated. I mean, the conflicts that people are going through in this day and age. I mean, diaspora of those days, 50 years ago, was a totally different thing than how we see it today. And I think these are issues that are difficult to touch, but important to really reveal this whole relationship, especially with what's happening in the society with kids, with adult workers, abused people, and so on. That's not to forget those, is what I meant.
Thanks, Elana. Do you want to say a few words of farewell before we all disappear in our different directions? Elana?
Me? Oh,
yeah.
I just want to thank everybody, or Tom, or both, because we tried to keep it for 90 minutes. We have 2 minutes from now. And I think it's so enjoyable for me. It was also the whole idea that the short papers, but you get an idea, ideas for questions come up, and then the discussion, and it's really easy to do in 90 minutes. I mean, in spite of all the things that went wrong with us, one cancellation after another, one coronavirus after another, and so on. So for me, it was very enjoyable. And I want to thank all the presenters, not just for keeping time. That's obvious, right? Because Tom has his big clock, so. But also because the content was so interesting. I think sometimes 5-minute papers are so powerful, and you get to see pictures and you get irritated with an idea. So I really congratulate all of you, and also the two colleagues, how many emails and time together Robert and Tom and myself spent, which was also fun. And so just wishing you the best, and come up with other ideas like this, maybe once a month, maybe whatever. We are all welcoming these ideas, and Tom wants to say something.
Well, I just want to make an observation, Elana, that all of these 5 presenters presented their papers at the workshop.
Right.
And how many people are watching now, Robert?
We've got 60. We've got 60 at one point.
None of these presenters today had 50 people, I would bet, in their session in the workshop. So now,
right,
this is a fantastic way to disseminate your work, because now you have a much bigger audience than you did at the workshop.
Exactly. Yeah.
And thank you all, everybody.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all, and thanks for coming. Okay.
Thanks, now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.